The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Westfield Academy, catching dust particles that danced in the air of the 100-year-old building. The polished marble floors reflected the light, creating an almost magical glow in the hallways. It was against this backdrop of wealth and tradition that 12-year-old Elijah Carter walked with his shoulders slightly hunched, trying to make himself as small as possible. Elijah was new at Westfield, having arrived just 3 weeks ago. Unlike the other students whose parents paid the school's steep tuition with ease, he was there on a rare academic scholarship. His worn blue backpack, patched at the bottom where the fabric had frayed, hung from one shoulder. The uniform he wore had been bought second-hand, and though his mother had stayed up late washing and ironing it, the blazer was still slightly too big, the previous owner having been broader in the shoulders. As he walked toward his locker, Elijah kept his eyes down, focusing on the pattern in the marble rather than meeting the gazes of his classmates. He had quickly learned that eye contact often invited unwanted attention, particularly from Blake Harrington and his friends. Blake was the unofficial king of the 6th grade at Westfield. His father was the CEO of a tech company and the school's biggest donor. The new science building had Harrington engraved above its entrance. Blake had never known what it was like to want for anything, and he wore his privilege like armor, wielding it like a weapon against those he deemed unworthy of Westfield's hallowed halls. "Well, look who it is." Blake's voice rang out across the hallway, cutting through the morning chatter. "The charity case." Elijah pretended not to hear, quickening his pace slightly. He reached his locker and focused intently on the combination lock, turning it with practiced precision, right to 24, left to 16, right to 8. The familiar routine was calming, giving him something to concentrate on besides the approaching footsteps. "I'm talking to you, scholarship boy," Blake said, now standing directly behind Elijah. 2 of Blake's friends flanked him, creating a half circle that trapped Elijah against the wall of lockers. Elijah turned slowly, his heart thumping against his ribs. "I have a name," he said quietly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Blake raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, he speaks, and with such attitude. Did you hear that, guys? The charity case has opinions," the boys laughed on cue, their expensive haircuts bouncing as they nodded in agreement with whatever Blake said, as they always did. Elijah said nothing this time, waiting for the inevitable moment when they would grow bored and move on to their next target. He'd become good at waiting things out over the past few weeks. "What's in the bag today?" Blake asked, reaching for Elijah's backpack. "Another lunch from home? Let me guess, peanut butter again?" Elijah clutched his backpack closer. Inside was indeed a peanut butter sandwich, carefully packed by his mother that morning. They couldn't afford the school's meal plan, and the free lunch program at Westfield was something Elijah had been too ashamed to sign up for yet. "Leave him alone," a voice called from down the hallway. All heads turned to see Ms. Reynolds, the music teacher, walking briskly toward them. She was younger than most teachers at Westfield, with bright eyes that seemed to miss nothing and a reputation for being fair but firm. "Just having a friendly chat with our new classmate, Ms. Reynolds," Blake said, his tone instantly transforming into one of polite innocence. Ms. Reynolds looked between the boys, her gaze lingering on Elijah's tense posture. "The bell will ring in 3 minutes. I suggest you all get to your homerooms." Blake nodded, flashing his practiced smile that charmed most adults instantly. "Of course, Ms. Reynolds, we were just leaving." He turned to go but paused to look back at Elijah. "See you in music class, scholarship boy." Elijah watched them walk away, their expensive shoes clicking on the marble floor. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You okay?" Ms. Reynolds asked quietly when the others were out of earshot. Elijah nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." She studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Don't let them get to you. Their opinion doesn't define your worth." She glanced at her watch. "Better hurry now." "And Elijah? I'm looking forward to having you in music class later." As Ms. Reynolds walked away, Elijah felt a small flicker of warmth. At least one person at Westfield didn't look at him like he didn't belong. The morning passed in a blur of classes where Elijah sat in the back row, raising his hand only when directly called upon despite knowing most of the answers. He'd always been a good student. It was how he'd gotten the scholarship in the first place, but he'd quickly learned that standing out academically only gave Blake and his friends more reasons to target him. By the time music class arrived after lunch, Elijah's stomach was in knots. It was the one class where he couldn't blend into the background. Ms. Reynolds believed in participation, which meant everyone had to contribute in some way during each session. The music room was Elijah's favorite place at Westfield. Unlike the imposing classrooms with their rows of desks and stern portraits of former headmasters, the music room felt alive. Instruments lined the walls: violins, cellos, flutes, clarinets, and in the corner stood a beautiful grand piano, its black surface gleaming under the lights. Elijah slipped into the room, taking his usual seat near the back just as the bell rang. Blake and his friends were already there, lounging in their chairs as if they owned the place. Ms. Reynolds stood at the front, waiting for everyone to settle down. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said once the chatter had died down. "Before we begin today's lesson, I have an exciting announcement to make." The class perked up at this. Announcements usually meant special events or trips, things that broke the monotony of the school routine. This year, Westfield will be hosting a special spring concert, Ms. Reynolds continued, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "And unlike our usual performances, this one will be open to the public. Parents, family, friends, even some local media have expressed interest." A murmur of excitement rippled through the classroom. Performing at Westfield was a big deal. The school was known for its excellent arts program, and many former students had gone on to prestigious music schools and even professional careers. "The concert will showcase individual talents as well as group performances," Ms. Reynolds explained. "And I'd like every student in this class to participate in some way." Blake's hand shot up. "Ms. Reynolds, when you say every student, do you mean literally everyone?" His eyes slid to Elijah. "Even our newest classmates?" Ms. Reynolds didn't miss the implication. "Yes, Blake, music is universal. Everyone has something to contribute." Blake turned in his seat, looking directly at Elijah now. "Have you ever even been to a concert, scholarship boy? Or is that something else your family can't afford?" A few nervous laughs scattered across the room. Ms. Reynolds frowned. "That's enough, Blake. In this classroom, we respect each other." But Blake wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair with a calculated casualness. "I'm just curious what instrument our friend here plays. Or maybe he just sings in the shower." Elijah felt his cheeks burn as all eyes turned to him. The truth was, he did play an instrument, and quite well. Before his father had lost his job and his family had moved to this town searching for work, Elijah had taken piano lessons for years. His grandmother had been a piano teacher, and after she passed away, his parents had scraped together enough money for lessons at a community center because they saw how much it meant to him. But no one at Westfield knew that. And somehow, sitting there with Blake's challenging stare fixed on him, Elijah couldn't bring himself to say it. It felt too personal, too precious to share in this hostile environment. "Elijah, you don't need to answer that," Ms. Reynolds said firmly. But Blake pressed on. "I have a great idea, Ms. Reynolds. Since this concert is such a big deal, why don't we feature a solo on the grand piano? And I nominate our scholarship student to do the honors." The room went quiet. Even Blake's friends looked surprised at the boldness of his suggestion. It was a clear setup. Put the poor new kid on the most prominent instrument in the most public venue to fail spectacularly. Ms. Reynolds opened her mouth, likely to shut down the idea, but Elijah found himself speaking first. "Okay," he said softly. The single word hung in the air. Blake's smirk faltered for a moment before returning with renewed force. "What was that?" he asked, cupping his ear dramatically. "Did the scholarship boy just volunteer?" Elijah looked up, meeting Blake's eyes directly for the first time. Something inside him had snapped. Maybe it was weeks of enduring whispers and side-eyes. Maybe it was the memory of his grandmother telling him that music could speak when words failed. Or maybe it was simply that he was tired of hiding. "I said okay," Elijah repeated louder this time. "I'll play the piano at the concert." Ms. Reynolds looked concerned. "Elijah, you don't have to." "I want to," he interrupted, surprising himself with his firmness. "I'd like to play at the concert." Blake was practically gleeful, exchanging looks with his friends that clearly said they couldn't believe their luck. "Well, well, looks like we have our pianist. This should be interesting." Ms. Reynolds studied Elijah for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If you're sure, Elijah, then yes, you can perform a piano piece. We'll need to discuss what you'll play and arrange practice times." The rest of the class passed in a daze for Elijah. He barely heard Ms. Reynolds discussing the other aspects of the concert, his mind racing with thoughts of what he'd just committed to. Part of him was terrified. He hadn't touched a piano in weeks, not since moving to this town. The grand piano in the music room was far nicer than anything he'd ever played on before, but another part of him, a part that felt strangely like his grandmother's spirit, was calm. He knew what Blake was trying to do. He knew what everyone expected, for the poor scholarship boy to make a fool of himself on stage. They were all waiting for him to fail. As the bell rang and students began filing out of the classroom, Blake brushed past Elijah's desk. "Hope you know what you're doing, scholarship boy," he whispered. "Everyone will be watching." Elijah said nothing, but as he packed up his things, a quiet determination settled over him. Yes, everyone would be watching, and maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing after all. Word about Elijah's upcoming piano performance spread through Westfield Academy like wildfire. By the end of the school day, it seemed everyone had heard about the scholarship boy who would be playing the grand piano at the spring concert. Some students looked at him with curiosity as he passed in the hallways, while others whispered and laughed behind their hands. Blake had made sure the story was told with just the right spin. The poor kid who clearly didn't belong was about to make a spectacle of himself. Elijah kept his head down, moving quickly between classes. He regretted his impulsive decision to accept Blake's challenge, but there was no backing out now. The thought of standing on stage in front of the entire school, parents, and even local media made his stomach twist into knots. What had he been thinking? At the end of the day, Elijah lingered in the hallway outside the music room. Most students had already left, rushing off to after-school activities or waiting cars. Through the partially open door, he could hear the soft notes of the piano. Someone was playing a piece he recognized, Debussy's Clair de Lune, one of his grandmother's favorites. He peeked inside to see Ms. Reynolds at the piano, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys. Elijah stood silently, letting the music wash over him. It had been weeks since he'd heard live piano music, and the familiar melody made his heart ache with a mixture of longing and memory. When the final notes faded away, he must have made some small sound, because Ms. Reynolds turned suddenly. "Elijah," she said, looking surprised but pleased. "I didn't realize anyone was there." "I'm sorry," he said quickly, stepping back. "I didn't mean to interrupt." She smiled, gesturing for him to come in. "You weren't interrupting at all. Did you need something?" Elijah hesitated, then entered the music room, his backpack clutched tightly in one hand. I was wondering if I could talk to you about the concert." Ms. Reynolds nodded, moving over on the piano bench to make room for him. "Of course. Have a seat." Elijah sat down carefully, leaving as much space between them as the bench would allow. The black and white keys gleamed before him, both familiar and intimidating. "I wanted to say I'm sorry for interrupting your class today," he began, "and maybe I shouldn't have agreed to play at the concert." Ms. Reynolds studied him thoughtfully. "You don't have to do this, you know. I can speak to Blake about his behavior, and we can find another way for you to participate." Elijah shook his head. "No, that would just make things worse." He paused, gathering his courage. "The thing is, Ms. Reynolds, I actually do play the piano. Or at least I used to." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, for how long?" 6 years, he replied. "My grandmother was a piano teacher. She started teaching me when I was 5. After she passed away, I took lessons at a community center in my old neighborhood." Understanding dawned on Ms. Reynolds' face. "And Blake has no idea." Elijah shook his head. "Nobody here does." A small smile played at the corners of Ms. Reynolds' mouth. "Well, that certainly puts things in a different light." She looked at him curiously. "May I ask why you kept this to yourself?" Elijah stared down at his hands. They were different from the other boys' hands at Westfield. Slightly rougher, with a small callus on his right thumb from where he helped his dad with repair work on weekends. But they were also a pianist's hands with long fingers and a stretch that his grandmother had always said was a gift. It's something that's mine," he said finally. "Something personal. And everything here is so different from my old life. I guess I wanted to keep one thing just for me, you know?" Ms. Reynolds nodded, seeming to understand perfectly. "Music can be like that, something deeply personal. But it's also meant to be shared, don't you think?" Elijah considered this. His grandmother had always told him that music was a conversation between the pianist and the listener, a way of speaking without words. "Maybe," he conceded. but I haven't practiced in weeks. We don't have a piano at our new place. The apartment his family had moved into was half the size of their old house, with thin walls and neighbors who complained about the slightest noise. Well, you're in luck, Ms. Reynolds said, gesturing to the grand piano before them. This one isn't being used after school hours. You're welcome to practice here if you'd like. Elijah's heart leapt at the offer. Really? I could use this piano? She nodded. I stay late most days to grade papers and plan lessons. You could practice until 5 o'clock when I leave. And if you're serious about the concert, we should start thinking about what piece you might want to play. For the first time since agreeing to Blake's challenge, Elijah felt a flutter of excitement rather than dread. He looked at the keys before him, his fingers itching to touch them. Would you like to play something now? Ms. Reynolds asked gently. Just to get a feel for it? Elijah hesitated only briefly before placing his hands on the keys. The cool ivory felt like greeting an old friend. He started with a simple scale just to warm up, then transitioned into the first piece his grandmother had ever taught him to play all the way through, Bach's Minuet in G. It was a simple piece, one that most piano students learned early on, but Elijah played it with a care and precision that spoke of his training. When he finished, Ms. Reynolds was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You play beautifully, Elijah, she said. Your grandmother taught you well. Elijah felt his cheeks warm at the praise. Thank you, but this piece is too simple for the concert. I should play something more impressive. Ms. Reynolds shook her head. The most impressive playing comes from the heart, not from technical difficulty. Choose a piece that means something to you. Elijah thought about this as he walked home that afternoon. The familiar weight of his backpack felt lighter somehow, as if sharing his secret had lifted a burden. He took a detour past the town's small park, where the cherry trees were just beginning to blossom, their pale pink flowers catching the late afternoon light. What piece should he play? It needed to be something he knew well, something he could perfect with a few weeks of practice, but it also needed to be something that would show Blake and the others that they had underestimated him. Most importantly, it needed to be a piece his grandmother would have been proud to hear him play. By the time he reached the apartment building, Elijah had made his decision. He took the stairs to the 3rd floor, unlocking the door to find his mother already home from her shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse's aide. Hey, sweetie, she called from the kitchen where she was unpacking groceries. How was school today? Elijah set his backpack down and went to help her. It was interesting, he said, taking a carton of eggs and placing it carefully in the refrigerator. There's going to be a spring concert at school. I'm going to play the piano. His mother paused, a can of soup halfway to the shelf. Really? But we don't have a piano here for you to practice. My music teacher said I can use the one at school, Elijah explained. She stays late so I can practice until 5. His mother's face softened. That's wonderful, Elijah. Your grandmother would be so happy to know you're playing again. She hesitated, then added, But will this mean you'll be home later? I don't like the idea of you walking back by yourself when it's getting dark. I can take the bus, Elijah said quickly. There's a stop right by school. His mother looked torn. Money was tight and bus fare twice a day would add up, but she could see the excitement in her son's eyes, something she hadn't seen since they'd moved to this town. We'll make it work, she said finally. Your dad and I will figure out the bus fare. Or maybe we can arrange a carpool with someone. She smiled, reaching out to ruffle his hair. So what piece are you going to play? One of your grandmother's favorites? Elijah nodded. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. His mother's eyes widened slightly. That's a difficult piece, Elijah. Are you sure? I can do it, he said with quiet determination. Grandma always said I was ready for it. I want to make her proud. His mother pulled him into a hug. You already do every single day. Over the next few days, Elijah fell into a new routine. He still kept to himself during the school day, still endured Blake's taunts and the curious stares of his classmates. But now, when the final bell rang, he headed straight to the music room. There, with Ms. Reynolds grading papers at her desk, he practiced. The grand piano was unlike anything he'd ever played before. The action of the keys was different from the upright piano at his old community center, requiring a lighter touch in some places and more force in others. The sound was richer, fuller, with overtones that seemed to hang in the air. At first, Elijah approached it timidly, afraid of making mistakes on such a magnificent instrument. But gradually, as the days passed, he grew more confident. He started with scales and exercises to get his fingers back in shape, then moved on to the Chopin piece. It was challenging, with its dramatic shifts in mood and technical demands, but Elijah worked through it section by section. Ms. Reynolds occasionally offered suggestions, but mostly she let him work at his own pace, recognizing his natural talent and disciplined approach. One afternoon, about a week after he'd started practicing, Elijah was so absorbed in a particularly difficult passage that he didn't notice someone watching through the music room window. It was only when he paused to make a notation on his sheet music that he caught a glimpse of movement. He looked up to see Blake quickly ducking away from the door. Elijah's stomach dropped. Had Blake heard him playing? Would he now change his plan? Realizing that Elijah wasn't going to embarrass himself after all, he mentioned it to Ms. Reynolds the next day, his worry evident. "Let him listen," she said simply. "Music has a way of changing people, Elijah. Sometimes when words fail, a beautiful melody can reach places in the heart that nothing else can." Elijah wasn't sure he believed that Blake Harrington had a heart to reach, but he nodded anyway. He couldn't control what Blake did or didn't do. He could only focus on his own preparation, on making each practice session count. As the weeks passed, the concert drew closer. Posters went up around the school announcing the event. Other students began discussing their performances in the hallways and at lunch. Elijah remained silent about his own preparation, but he could feel a shift in the atmosphere around him. The whispers continued, but they had a different quality now. Less mocking, more curious. Blake had been surprisingly quiet lately. He still sat with his usual group at lunch, still walked the hallways like he owned them, but he no longer went out of his way to torment Elijah. Once or twice, Elijah even caught Blake watching him with an expression that wasn't quite a sneer. The day before the concert, Elijah stayed later than usual at the piano. Ms. Reynolds had a meeting and told him he could practice until the janitor came by on his rounds. Elijah played the ballade from beginning to end, focusing on the emotional journey of the piece rather than just the notes. When he finished, he was startled by the sound of applause. He turned to see the janitor standing in the doorway, a mop in one hand. "That was something special, son," the older man said with a gentle smile. "Whoever's coming to hear you tomorrow is in for quite a treat." Elijah thanked him, gathering his sheet music with slightly trembling hands. Tomorrow everyone would hear him play. The thought was terrifying and thrilling all at once. As he walked home, taking the long way through the park again, Elijah thought about his grandmother. She had always told him that when he played, she could hear his heart in the music. "That's what makes a true pianist," she'd say. "Not just playing the notes, but playing your truth." Tomorrow Elijah would play his truth, and whatever happened afterward, he would know that he had honored his grandmother's memory and stayed true to himself. No matter what Blake or anyone else thought, that was what really mattered. The morning of the concert arrived with a sky full of clouds that couldn't seem to decide whether to part for the sun or gather for rain. Elijah woke before his alarm, his mind already racing with thoughts of the day ahead. He lay in bed for a few extra minutes, staring at the ceiling of the small bedroom he shared with his younger brother, who was still fast asleep in the twin bed across the room. Today was the day. After weeks of practice, of rushing to the music room after school, of working through difficult passages until his fingers ached, he would finally play for an audience. Not just any audience, but the entire school, parents, teachers, and even some local reporters that Ms. Reynolds had mentioned might attend. The thought made his stomach clench. He slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake his brother. Their apartment was still dark and quiet, his parents not yet up for their early shifts. Elijah padded to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face to clear away the last traces of sleep. As he looked in the mirror, he saw dark circles under his eyes from staying up late going over the piece in his mind. Hearing the music even without a piano to play it on, the apartment came to life gradually as his family woke. His mother made breakfast, the smell of pancakes filling the small kitchen. His father, already dressed in his work uniform for the warehouse where he'd found a job, sat at the table with a cup of coffee. "Big day, huh?" his father said, looking up as Elijah entered the kitchen. Elijah nodded, sliding into his chair. "Yeah, nervous?" his mother asked, placing a stack of pancakes in front of him. "A little," Elijah admitted, though a little was a massive understatement. His father reached across the table to squeeze his shoulder. "You'll do great, son. We're proud of you for putting yourself out there." "We'll be there tonight," his mother added. "I switched shifts with Patricia so I could make it, and your dad's boss let him leave early." Elijah felt a wave of gratitude. He knew how hard his parents worked, how every hour of pay mattered in keeping their family afloat. That they would rearrange their schedules to be at his performance meant everything. "Thanks," he said simply, but his parents seemed to understand all the words he couldn't find. At school there was a buzz of excitement in the air. The concert was the main topic of conversation in every hallway and classroom. Students who were performing compared notes on their pieces or what they planned to wear. Those who weren't still discussed which performances they were most looking forward to. Elijah moved through the day in a fog, his mind constantly returning to the Chopin piece, mentally practicing difficult sections. He barely heard his teacher's lessons, earning a few concerned looks when he failed to answer questions. Lunch was a blur. He couldn't eat much, his stomach too knotted with anticipation. In music class, Ms. Reynolds announced that all performers would be excused from their last 2 periods to prepare. They would gather in the music room for final instructions and then move to the auditorium for a brief sound check before the evening performance. When the time came, Elijah made his way to the music room with the other performers. Some were in small groups, nervously practicing their parts together. Others sat alone, reviewing sheet music or simply looking terrified. A girl with a violin was playing the same passage over and over, her brow furrowed in concentration. Blake was there too, standing with a group of boys who would be performing a rock song together. Blake played guitar. Of course he did, and of course his instrument was top of the line. He caught Elijah's eye as he entered, but quickly looked away, busying himself with tuning his guitar. Ms. Reynolds clapped her hands for attention. "All right, everyone. You've all worked very hard for tonight, and I know you're going to do beautifully." She went through the program order, reminding everyone where they should wait before their performance and where to go afterward. Elijah would be performing near the end of the concert, just before the final group number. It was a prime spot, one that would normally go to the most accomplished musician. He wondered if Ms. Reynolds had arranged it that way on purpose, or if it was just how the program had worked out. As they filed into the auditorium for the sound check, Elijah got his first look at the setup for the evening. The stage was larger than he'd imagined, with professional lighting that made everything look more official. The grand piano had been moved from the music room to center stage, polished to a high shine under the lights. One by one, the performers took their places to check sound levels and get a feel for the space. When Elijah's turn came, he walked slowly to the piano, acutely aware of everyone watching. The bench felt different from the one in the music room, slightly higher. He adjusted it carefully before placing his hands on the keys. Ms. Reynolds had suggested he play just a small section for the sound check to get comfortable with the acoustics of the space. Elijah chose the opening of the ballade, playing just enough to feel how the notes resonated in the large room. The sound was magnificent, filling the space in a way he hadn't experienced before. Despite his nervousness, a small thrill ran through him at the pure beauty of it. As he finished and stood to leave the stage, he noticed Blake watching him with an unreadable expression. For once there was no smirk, no challenge in his gaze. If anything, he looked thoughtful. After the sound check, they had a few hours before the evening performance. Some students went home to change and eat dinner. Others, like Elijah, who lived too far to make the trip back and forth, were allowed to stay and use empty classrooms to prepare. Elijah found a quiet corner in the library, spreading his sheet music on a table, though he no longer needed it. The notes were embedded in his memory now, in his fingers. Still, looking at the familiar markings calmed him somehow, a visual reminder of all the work he'd put in. As the afternoon faded into evening, Elijah changed into the clothes his mother had carefully ironed the night before. His best pants and a button-up shirt that had been a gift from his grandmother the Christmas before she passed away. It wasn't as fancy as what some of the other students would be wearing, but it was clean and neat, and it connected him to the person who had first placed his small hands on piano keys. Backstage, as the auditorium began to fill with audience members, the nervous energy among the performers was palpable. A boy with a trumpet kept taking deep breaths and letting them out slowly. The girl with the violin was pacing in small circles. Even Blake, usually so confident, was repeatedly running his hand through his hair, messing up the careful styling. Ms. Reynolds moved among them, offering words of encouragement and last-minute advice. When she reached Elijah, she simply placed a hand on his shoulder and gave a gentle squeeze. "Remember what we talked about," she said quietly. "Play your truth." The concert began with a welcome from the school principal, followed by the first performers, a flute and clarinet duet by two 8th-grade girls. From backstage, Elijah could hear the polite applause after each performance, occasionally punctuated by enthusiastic cheers from proud parents. As the program progressed, Elijah peeked through the curtain to scan the audience. The auditorium was packed, with people standing along the walls in the back. He spotted his parents in the middle section, his mother in her best dress, his father looking uncomfortable but proud in a tie. They had managed to come just as they promised. The sight of them there, supporting him despite everything else they had to worry about, gave him a surge of determination. Then, much sooner than he expected, Blake and his friends were taking the stage with their guitars and drum set. They played a popular rock song, and though Elijah was reluctant to admit it, they were actually quite good. Blake, in particular, played with a natural ease, his fingers moving confidently over the strings. The audience responded enthusiastically with loud applause and a few whistles. As Blake exited the stage, he passed close to where Elijah waited. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment Elijah thought Blake might say something. But he just nodded slightly and continued past, rejoining his friends who were celebrating their successful performance. And then it was time. Ms. Reynolds announced him as Elijah Carter, performing Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, Opus 23. The sound of his name echoing through the auditorium made everything suddenly very real. Elijah took a deep breath, smoothed his shirt, and walked onto the stage. The lights were brighter than during the sound check, making it hard to see the audience clearly. He could make out vague shapes, hear the rustle of programs and occasional cough, but the faces blurred together in the darkness beyond the stage. He approached the piano, adjusting the bench just as he had during the sound check. As he sat down, a hush fell over the auditorium. Elijah placed his hands on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness beneath his fingertips. He closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself in the silence. In that moment of quiet, Elijah thought of his grandmother. He remembered her hands guiding his, her voice gently correcting his posture or suggesting a different interpretation of a phrase. He remembered her joy when he mastered a difficult piece and her patient encouragement when he struggled. He remembered her telling him that music was a gift you gave to others, a piece of your soul offered up in notes and rhythms. He opened his eyes, took one more deep breath, and began to play. The opening notes of the ballad floated out over the audience, soft and questioning. Elijah felt the familiar sensation of falling into the music, of everything else, the audience, the stage, even his own nervousness, fading away until there was only himself and the piano and Chopin's beautiful, complex composition. The piece built gradually, from its contemplative beginning to passages of increasing intensity. Elijah's fingers moved across the keys with precision and emotion, drawing out the narrative quality of the music, the story without words that had captivated listeners for nearly 2 centuries. As he reached the more technically demanding sections, Elijah felt completely in control. The hours of practice had paid off. His muscle memory took over, allowing him to focus on the expressiveness of his playing rather than the mechanics of it. His body swayed slightly with the music, responding physically to the emotional journey of the piece. When he reached the dramatic climax, his hands moving rapidly up and down the keyboard in cascades of notes, he could sense the audience's reaction even without seeing them clearly. A collective holding of breath, a leaning forward in seats. The power of the music filled the auditorium, touching something universal in those who listened. And then, as the final chords resolved the tension of the piece, bringing it to its conclusion, Elijah felt a profound sense of completion. He held the last note, letting it ring out and gradually fade away, his hand still poised above the keys as the sound diminished to silence. For a moment, that silence was complete. Elijah remained still, his heart pounding, the echo of the music still resonating in his mind. He hadn't just played the notes, he had played his truth, just as his grandmother had taught him, just as Ms. Reynolds had reminded him to do. He lowered his hand slowly and lifted his head, ready to face whatever response awaited him in the darkness beyond the stage. The silence lasted only seconds, but to Elijah, it felt like an eternity. He sat at the piano, hands now resting in his lap, waiting. Had he made a mistake? Had he misinterpreted the piece? Had his fingers stumbled somewhere without him noticing? Then it came. A single person began to clap, followed immediately by another and another until the entire auditorium erupted in thunderous applause. It was unlike anything Elijah had ever experienced, a wall of sound crashing over him, surrounding him completely. He blinked in the bright stage lights, trying to make out individual faces in the audience, but could only see a sea of movement as people rose to their feet. A standing ovation. They were giving him a standing ovation. Elijah stood shakily, his legs feeling oddly disconnected from his body. He moved to the front of the stage and gave a small bow, just as Ms. Reynolds had instructed all the performers to do. The applause grew even louder. He could hear voices now, too, cheers and whistles piercing through the general roar. In the third row, his parents were on their feet, his mother wiping tears from her cheeks, his father clapping so hard it looked like it might hurt. Near the back, Ms. Reynolds stood with her hands clasped under her chin, her face glowing with pride. And scattered throughout the audience, Elijah's classmates watched with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to, in the case of Blake and his friends, utter disbelief. Elijah bowed once more, then made his way off the stage, his heart still racing. In the wing, several other performers waited, some for their own turns, others simply to congratulate him. A few patted him on the back as he passed. The girl with the violin gave him a thumbs up and a wide smile. "That was," she began, then shook her head, apparently unable to find the right words. Elijah nodded, understanding completely. He didn't have words for what had just happened either. He found a quiet corner backstage to sit and let his breathing return to normal. The concert continued, but Elijah barely registered the performances that followed his. His mind was still playing and replaying moments from his own time on stage. The feel of the keys, the sound filling the auditorium, the incredible response. When the final group number ended and all the performers were called back to the stage for a final bow, Elijah joined them, still in a daze. The applause was generous for everyone, but he couldn't help noticing that as he stepped forward for his individual recognition, the volume increased significantly. He caught Blake's eye across the stage and was surprised to see something like respect in the other boy's gaze. As the formal part of the evening concluded, the audience was invited to a small reception in the school cafeteria. Performers mingled with family members and teachers, accepting congratulations and discussing their pieces. Elijah found himself surrounded by people he'd never spoken to before. Parents of other students, teachers from departments he didn't take classes in, even a woman who introduced herself as a reporter from the local newspaper. "That was quite extraordinary," she said, notepad in hand. "How long have you been playing?" Before Elijah could answer, his parents appeared at his side, his mother immediately pulling him into a tight hug. "We are so proud of you," she whispered against his hair. When she pulled back, her eyes were shining with tears. "Your grandmother would have been over the moon." His father, never one for many words, simply squeezed his shoulder, but the pride in his eyes said everything. The reporter smiled at the family moment, then continued, "I'd love to do a feature on you for our weekend edition. Would that be all right?" Elijah looked to his parents, unsure how to respond. His father nodded encouragingly. "I guess that would be okay," Elijah said. As the reporter jotted down some notes and arranged to speak with them further the next day, the school principal approached their small group. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he said, shaking their hands. "You must be incredibly proud. Elijah's performance was remarkable." "Thank you," his mother replied. "We are." The principal turned to Elijah. "Young man, I've been at this school for 15 years, and I don't think I've ever heard playing quite like that at one of our concerts." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Ms. Reynolds tells me you've been practicing after school hours because you don't have a piano at home." Elijah nodded, not sure where this was going. "Well, I think we might be able to do something about that. Our music department has been looking to replace some of the practice pianos in the smaller rehearsal rooms. Nothing wrong with them, they're just older models. Rather than selling them, I think we could arrange to have one donated to a promising student. Elijah's eyes widened. Was the principal offering him a piano? He looked at his parents, who seemed equally surprised. That's very generous, his father began. But our apartment is small and I'm not sure. It's an upright, the principal clarified quickly. Not a grand like the one Elijah played tonight. And of course, if space is an issue, we could look into other arrangements. Perhaps dedicated practice time before and after school hours or over the weekends. We'll make room, Elijah's mother said firmly, placing a hand on her husband's arm. If Elijah wants it, we'll make it work. Elijah could hardly believe what he was hearing. His own piano? After weeks of having to wait until after school? Of having to rush home before it got too dark? Of having the music in his head with no way to let it out? I'd like that very much, he said quietly. Thank you, sir. The principal smiled. No need to thank me. Talent like yours deserves nurturing. He glanced around the crowded cafeteria. And I think there are a few other people who'd like to speak with you. Quite the celebrity tonight, aren't you? As the principal moved away, Elijah saw he was right. Several students were hovering nearby, clearly waiting for a chance to talk to him. Among them was a face he recognized immediately. Blake Harrington, standing slightly apart from his usual group of friends, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. Elijah excused himself from his parents and the reporter, promising to find them again soon. He made his way through the crowd, stopping occasionally as people offered congratulations. When he reached Blake, they stood facing each other awkwardly for a moment. That was... Blake started, then cleared his throat. You're really good. Coming from Blake, this simple statement felt more significant than all the effusive praise Elijah had received from others. Thanks, he said. Blake shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Why didn't you say anything? About playing piano, I mean. He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with directly acknowledging what he'd done. Elijah considered the question. Would it have made a difference? If you'd known I could play? Blake had the grace to look embarrassed. Probably not, he admitted. I was being a jerk. The simple acknowledgement surprised Elijah. He'd expected excuses or justifications, not this straightforward admission. Yeah, you were, Elijah agreed. A ghost of a smile crossed Blake's face. Fair enough. He paused, then added, The offer to play the piano was supposed to be a joke at your expense. But I guess the joke was on me. Elijah shrugged. It wasn't about you. No, Blake agreed. It definitely wasn't. He hesitated, then held out his hand. No hard feelings? Elijah looked at the extended hand, thinking about the weeks of whispers and taunts, the snide comments about his scholarship status, the deliberate attempts to make him feel like an outsider. Could all of that really be erased with a handshake? No, he decided. It couldn't, but maybe it was a start. He took Blake's hand and shook it briefly. We'll see. Blake nodded, accepting that this was the best he could hope for at the moment. If you ever want to jam sometime. I play guitar, as you saw. Not nearly as well as you play piano, but maybe, Elijah said, not committing but not refusing either. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ms. Reynolds, who had finally made her way through the crowd to find her star pupil. Elijah, she said warmly, I can't tell you how proud I am. She nodded acknowledgement to Blake. Blake, you and your friends did a wonderful job with your piece as well. Thanks, Ms. Reynolds, Blake said. I was just telling Elijah how amazing his performance was. Ms. Reynolds raised an eyebrow slightly at this apparent change in attitude, but simply smiled. Yes, it was quite something. She turned back to Elijah. I've had several people asking me about you, including Mrs. Chen from the community orchestra and Dr. Phillips from the university's music department. They're both interested in speaking with you about some opportunities. Elijah blinked, overwhelmed. Opportunities? Scholarship programs, advanced lessons, summer music camps, that sort of thing, Ms. Reynolds explained. Things that could really help develop your talent. But I already have a scholarship, Elijah said, confused. For school, Ms. Reynolds smiled gently. These would be specifically for music, Elijah. Additional opportunities that wouldn't affect your academic scholarship. The implications slowly dawned on him. These weren't just people being polite or impressed by a school concert performance. These were serious musicians and educators who saw something in his playing, something worth investing in, worth nurturing. As Ms. Reynolds led him across the cafeteria to meet these new people, Elijah caught sight of his parents standing with the principal, deep in conversation. His mother was nodding enthusiastically at whatever was being said, while his father had the thoughtful expression he wore when considering important decisions. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions, conversations, and more congratulations than Elijah could count. By the time the janitors began stacking chairs to clean the cafeteria, signaling the end of the reception, he felt like he'd talked to half the town. His parents found him as the crowd was thinning out. "Ready to go home, superstar?" his father asked with a smile. Elijah nodded, suddenly exhausted but in the best possible way. Isha. As they walked through the school parking lot to the bus stop, they didn't own a car, his mother filled him in on her conversation with the principal and the music teacher. "They think you have real potential, Elijah," she said, her voice full of wonder and pride. "Mrs. Chen wants you to audition for a special program at the community center downtown. And Dr. Phillips talked about weekend classes at the university for gifted young musicians. What about the piano?" Elijah asked, remembering the principal's offer. "They're going to deliver it next weekend," his father said. "I'll clear out that corner of the living room. We can move the bookshelf to make space. But what about the neighbors?" Elijah asked, thinking of the thin walls and the complaints about noise. His mother smiled. "The principal is going to speak with our landlord about soundproofing options. And in the meantime, you'll just have to practice during reasonable hours." Elijah could hardly process everything that had happened. This morning he had been dreading the concert, seeing it as an ordeal to be endured. Now, hours later, it felt like his entire life had changed course. As they reached the bus stop, he looked back at the school building, its windows still lit up, the last few cars leaving the parking lot. Inside that building, he had faced one of his greatest fears. He had stood on a stage in front of people who had judged and dismissed him, and he had shown himself, what he was truly capable of. The bus arrived, its doors opening with a hydraulic hiss. As Elijah stepped aboard with his parents, he felt lighter somehow, as if he'd set down a heavy weight he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. There would be challenges ahead, of course. New opportunities meant new expectations, new pressures. But for now, for this moment, he allowed himself to simply feel the pure joy of being truly seen and heard. The bus pulled away from the curb, heading toward home. Elijah leaned his head against the cool glass of the window, watching the streets pass by. In his mind, Chopin's notes still played, a soundtrack to this unexpected turning point in his young life. And somewhere he was certain his grandmother was smiling. 6 months had passed since the spring concert that had changed everything for Elijah. The seasons had shifted from spring to summer and now to early fall, bringing with them transformations both in the world outside and in Elijah's life. The upright piano now occupied the corner of the Carters' small living room, just as promised. It wasn't new or fancy. The wood was scratched in places and one of the pedals squeaked if you pressed it too quickly. But to Elijah, it was perfect. Every morning before school, he would play for 30 minutes. The early hour a compromise with the neighbors who had initially been concerned about noise. But after hearing him play, even they had softened. Occasionally, requesting pieces through notes slipped under the family's door. "The boy in 3B would like to know if you could play something by Debussy," his mother had read from one such note, smiling. "He says it helps him study." Today was Saturday, which meant Elijah had the luxury of practicing longer. His fingers moved over the keys as he worked on a new piece, Rachmaninoff this time, more challenging than anything he'd attempted before. Dr. Phillips, his new instructor at the weekend program for young musicians, believed in pushing boundaries. "You have the technical skill," she told him during their last lesson. "Now we need to develop your range." A knock at the door interrupted his practice. His mother, who had been reading in the armchair by the window, set down her book. "That must be Mrs. Chen," she said, glancing at the clock. "Right on time," Elijah nodded, taking a deep breath. Mrs. Chen, the director of the community orchestra, was coming to discuss something important, a special opportunity she'd said on the phone, though she'd been vague about the details. His mother opened the door to reveal a small, elegant woman carrying a leather portfolio. After greetings and the offer of tea, which Mrs. Chen politely declined, they all sat around the kitchen table. "I'll get straight to the point," Mrs. Chen said, opening her portfolio. As you know, Elijah has been making remarkable progress in our weekend program. His talent is exceptional. His mother beamed with pride while Elijah looked down at his hands, still not entirely comfortable with praise. The reason for my visit is this, Mrs. Chen continued, pulling out a glossy brochure. Every year, the National Youth Music Foundation selects promising young musicians from across the country for their winter showcase in New York City. It's a prestigious event, attended by representatives from major conservatories, music schools, and arts foundations. She slid the brochure across the table. On the cover was a photo of young musicians on a grand stage looking polished and professional. I'd like to nominate Elijah for this year's showcase, Mrs. Chen said. He would perform a solo piece representing our district. Elijah stared at the brochure, his heartbeat quickening. New York City. A national showcase. It seemed impossible. That sounds like an amazing opportunity, his mother said carefully. But I imagine there must be costs involved. This was the reality of their lives. Every opportunity had to be weighed against practical considerations. Music lessons, sheet music, proper concert attire. These things added up quickly for a family on a tight budget. Mrs. Chen nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. Yes, there would normally be travel expenses, accommodation, registration fees. However, she added, her eyes brightening, the foundation offers full scholarships for exceptional candidates, and I believe Elijah would qualify. She pulled out more papers from her portfolio, application forms, recommendation letters already signed by herself and Dr. Phillips, even a draft of the personal statement Elijah would need to submit. I've taken the liberty of starting the paperwork, she explained. Of course, nothing will be submitted without your approval. But I wanted you to see how serious I am about this opportunity for Elijah. His mother looked through the papers, her expression a mixture of hope and caution. And you really think he has a chance at the scholarship? I wouldn't be here if I didn't, Mrs. Chen replied simply. Their conversation continued, moving on to details about the application process, the selection timeline, and what the showcase would entail. Elijah listened, trying to absorb it all, but his mind kept returning to one thought. New York. A real stage. An audience of people who took music as seriously as he did. After Mrs. Chen left with the promise that they would let her know their decision by Monday, Elijah returned to the piano. But instead of continuing with the Rachmaninoff, he found himself playing the Chopin ballad again, the piece that had started all of this. His mother came to stand beside the piano, listening. When he finished, she rested a hand on his shoulder. What do you think about Mrs. Chen's offer? She asked. Elijah considered the question. I want to do it, he said finally. But I know it's a lot, even with the scholarship. There would still be things we'd need. His mother squeezed his shoulder. Let your dad and me worry about that part. If this is something you really want, we'll find a way to make it happen. Elijah nodded, grateful beyond words for his parents' support. They had never once made him feel like his dream was a burden, even when it meant rearranging work schedules or stretching an already tight budget. Monday morning found Elijah back at Westfield Academy, where the fall semester was well underway. The hallways felt different now, or perhaps it was Elijah who was different. He no longer kept his eyes down as he walked, no longer tried to make himself invisible, and the other students had changed too. The scholarship boy who had once been an outsider was now known for something specific, something admirable. In the cafeteria at lunch, he sat at a table with a mix of students, some from his music theory class, which he'd added to his schedule this semester, and others he'd met through various school activities. He was in the middle of explaining a difficult passage in the Rachmaninoff piece when someone set their tray down at the end of the table. It was Blake. Though they had reached a kind of truce after the spring concert, they weren't exactly friends. Blake still ran with his usual crowd most of the time, but occasionally, like today, he would join Elijah's table. Hey, Blake said, nodding to the group. What are you guys talking about? Elijah was just telling us about this crazy hard piece he's learning, one of the girls explained. For the winter showcase, another added. The one in New York. Blake raised his eyebrows, looking at Elijah. New York? Seriously, that's huge. Elijah shrugged, trying to downplay it. I still have to get accepted. The application's due this week. You'll get in, Blake said with surprising confidence. After what you did at the concert? No doubt. Coming from Blake, this vote of confidence meant something. He had been there at the beginning. had seen the full arc of Elijah's journey from targeted outsider to respected musician. After school, Elijah headed to the music room for his regular practice session. Though he now had the piano at home, he still came to school early and stayed late 3 days a week. Partly it was practical. The grand piano was superior to his upright, offering him the chance to work with an instrument closer to what he would encounter at competitions and performances. But it was also because of Ms. Reynolds. She was already there when he arrived, grading papers at her desk. She looked up with a smile as he entered. Right on time. How was your weekend lesson with Dr. Phillips? Good, Elijah replied, setting his backpack down. Challenging but good, Ms. Reynolds nodded. She says you're making remarkable progress. One of her most promising students. Elijah felt his cheeks warm at the praise. She's a great teacher. And you're a great student, Ms. Reynolds countered. Which is why I wanted to talk to you about something before you start practicing today. She set down her pen and came to sit on the piano bench, gesturing for Elijah to join her. Mrs. Chen called me about the National Youth Music Foundation showcase. She came to see us on Saturday, Elijah confirmed. I'm working on the application now. Good, I'm glad to hear it. Ms. Reynolds paused. But there's something else I wanted to discuss with you. Something for the more distant future. She pulled a folder from her desk and opened it to reveal brochures for various music schools and conservatories. Juilliard, Eastman, Curtis, Berkeley. These are some of the top music programs in the country, she explained. Most offer full scholarships to exceptional students regardless of financial background. I think you should consider them. Elijah looked at the brochures, feeling a mixture of excitement and intimidation. These were names he knew, of course, places where the greatest musicians studied. But they had always seemed like distant dreams, not real possibilities. I know it's early, Ms. Reynolds continued. You're only in 7th grade. But it's never too soon to start thinking about these things, to set goals for yourself. Elijah picked up the Juilliard brochure, running his fingers over the glossy cover. You really think I could get into places like these? With continued hard work and the right opportunities? Absolutely. Ms. Reynolds's voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. The showcase in New York would be a big step in that direction. Representatives from some of these schools will be there, scouting for future talent. She closed the folder, handing it to him. Take these home. Look through them. Talk to your parents, and know that I'm here to help with whatever comes next. Elijah nodded, carefully placing the folder in his backpack. Thank you, Ms. Reynolds, for everything. She smiled, rising from the bench. No need to thank me, Elijah. Teachers dream of students like you. She gestured to the piano. Now I believe you have a Rachmaninoff piece to conquer. As Ms. Reynolds returned to her desk, Elijah positioned himself at the piano, flexing his fingers before placing them on the keys. He started to play, the complex notes filling the room. But his mind was racing ahead beyond the Rachmaninoff, beyond the showcase in New York to possibilities that had once seemed as distant as the stars. Later that evening, after dinner, Elijah sat with his parents at the kitchen table. The application for the showcase spread out before them, alongside the folder of conservatory brochures that Ms. Reynolds had given him. These are some very prestigious schools, his father said, examining the materials with interest. And expensive, I imagine.